The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. These are the now famous words written by H.P. Lovecraft in his 1927 essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature. And throughout his short career, through his monsters, he explored deep into the concept of fear and the unknown, searched for the furthest reaches of space, the depths of the ocean, and of the human mind. But the greatest unknown in which he rarely touched upon was the boundary of death. And one of the only times that he produced a real meditation on the subject was with the story of Herbert West, the Re-Animator. I first saw Re-Animator when I was a child, which I honestly probably shouldn't have, but did anyways. And it is a film that has always stuck with me my entire life. It, along with Night of the Living Dead, Thriller, and Resident Evil, are among my earliest memories concerning zombies. And what struck me about it was just how funny it was. There's just something really charming about this movie that really surprised me. I don't think comedy and horror is a bad thing at all, and this weird, violent film that felt like something I shouldn't be watching was really appealing to me at the time. Herbert West is, even above Victor Frankenstein, I think the perfect model of the mad scientist, a trope character dating all the way back to Mary Shelley's original novel. A man obsessed with the concept of death who unsuccessfully tries time and time again to fight its inevitability. The story concept is simple. Herbert West is a medical student who discovers what he calls his reagent, an unknown chemical that when injected into the dead, restarts the physical aspects of their life, with the more recently deceased subjects having more success in the reanimation process, and the subjects that have lingered in their graves a little too long, becoming ghoulish monsters, essentially being a prototype to zombies. As West puts it in the original story after a failed resurrection that ends up going on a rampage and killing several people, damn, it wasn't quite fresh enough. Re-Animator is a bit of a different type of franchise than what we have covered before in the series, because the source material is both very old and also in the public domain, meaning that anyone, if they wanted to, could create their own take on Re-Animator with a movie or comic book or sequel story. And so for the purposes of this video, I'm considering all adaptations of Lovecraft's original work to be a part of the same horror franchise, as they each have their own merits and demonstrate what different time periods saw as important aspects to include from the original. And what also marks it as different is the fact that the original H.P. Lovecraft story has never actually been really outright adapted. Like most films based on Dracula or Frankenstein, most of the Re-Animator adaptations only take pieces from the story to construct a mostly new plot. And this can be interesting to look at too, because that means that there are a lot of different takes on the base Re-Animator story that have different motivations and storytelling goals and styles. And these vary widely, from a video game in which West's reagent is used to bring back a zombie army in World War I, to West being a green-haired guitar-wielding mad scientist in a Japanese visual novel, to the magnitude of different fan creations that can be found right here on YouTube. There is even a reimagining of the story called Kanye West Re-Animator that focuses on Kanye bringing back dead hip-hop artists. And this alone is why I think the public domain is an amazing thing. It is a breeding ground for creativity, and that isn't the case with just this story. Lovecraft's entire bibliography is owned by the public, and the creative things that have been done with his work over the past 100 years is a really great defense for the public domain's existence. So I see this video as kind of an experiment. It's going to be a little bit longer and structured a little differently and looser from my other franchise videos in the past. It's a format that I don't plan to reuse, but I felt it was appropriate for doing a deep dive on the story and its adaptations. To really understand what each of these are trying to achieve though, we must first look back at the original work and see what made that unique at the time. It is in the opening paragraphs of the story that the narrator lays out fully what kind of a person Dr. Herbert West is, and where his true ambitions lie, when he describes him by saying, "My friend believed that artificial reanimation of the dead can depend only on the condition of the tissues, and that unless actual decomposition has set in, a corpse fully equipped with organs may with suitable measures be set going again, in the peculiar fashion known as life. That the psychic or intellectual life might be impaired by the slight deterioration of sensitive brain cells, which even a short period of death would be apt to cause, West fully realized." Herbert West is the kind of doctor that is only interested in the mechanical nature of the body. He does not care about the person contained within it. He does not concern himself with how they feel about what is happening to them. He only cares about the black and white differences between the living and the dead. In a sense, to Herbert West, a beating heart and only that is life. The narrator of the story is the unnamed assistant to Dr. West, a medical student who finds himself trapped in a deepening spiral from helping his friend commit their horrible experiments that only grow more insidious over time. The narrator here has very existential motives that contrast with West's more scientific goals. As he says at one point about their experiments, "I myself still held some curious notions about the traditional soul of man, and felt an awe at the secrets that might be told by one returning from the dead." And this is a concept that plagues him throughout the story and only increases over time. When their first success in resurrecting the dead happens, the narrator loses all control over himself and stops assisting West in the experiment. He bends down and whispers into the writhing body's ear, "Where have you been?" and is horrified to be responded to only with a resounding wail of moaning pain. This is an aspect that is absent in almost all adaptations of the Herbert West story, and I wish it wasn't, as to me it is the most frightening part of the whole affair. The juxtaposition of two ideologies is kind of the point of the tale, I believe. It is a narrative of the conflict between intellectual reason and spiritual faith, between a scientist that cares about humanity and a scientist that is a raging narcissist and feels nothing for anyone except himself. I think most adaptations miss the mark on that a bit when writing the motivations of these two men. As in most versions, the assistant is turned into more of a romantic-like figure than anything else. Despite being one of the most adapted of his body of work, the story was not received well then, and Lovecraft historians today do not look back on it as some great underappreciated tale. Lovecraft himself was not happy with the process. Before turning to write horror fiction, Lovecraft attempted unsuccessfully to have a career in journalism. And it was in this time that he became friends with George Julian Houghton, who went on to start the humor magazine Homebrew. And despite being a primarily humor-based magazine, Houghton wanted to give his friend a start to his career as a fiction author, and commissioned 6 horror stories from him to be featured in the magazine under the title Gruesome Tales. Houghton offered him $30, 5 for each of the 6 chapters, and Lovecraft took the deal as it was the first time in his career that he would have actually been paid for his work. But this deal came with stipulations. He couldn't make the story very graphic. The content had to be approved by Houghton, and they had to be serialized, containing the same characters. Lovecraft also had to begin each chapter with a recap of the previous chapter, and each chapter had to end on a cliffhanger as well. And this is unusual for his work and was not the writing style that he typically used at all. He occasionally did use chapters on his longer stories, but he never was one to reiterate information that he had already given you. You generally have to pay pretty close attention when reading his work to really get what's going on, which makes Re-Animator feel a little different from the rest of his stories and is at times distracting. The last chapter, for instance, is 6 pages long, and the first 3 pages of that is a recap of the previous events. So on a technical writing level, Re-Animator is indeed one of his weakest stories. Lovecraft pretended to be happy with this arrangement, but in private, in a letter to horror author Frank Belknap Long, he had the following to say: "This is manifestly unartistic. To write to order and to drag one figure through a series of artificial episodes involves the violation of all that spontaneity and singleness of impression which should characterize short story work. It reduces the unhappy author from art to the commonplace level of mechanical and unimaginative hack work. Nevertheless, when one needs the money, one is not scrupulous." It seems like the relationship was stable for a while, but the payments to Lovecraft for the installments began to arrive later and later, and he started to badmouth the work and Houghton more to other contemporary writers of the time. The last payment from Houghton was several months late, and even though the relationship had strained, this did not stop Lovecraft from writing another serialized story for Homebrew, The Lurking Fear. But it is through this venting of his frustration that it is clear that, at least at the time, Lovecraft was a little embarrassed by the quality of the story. Gruesome Tales was not a widely read story. Homebrew was not a massively circulated magazine. and is really only known today because of Lovecraft's association with it. And like most of Lovecraft's work, the story faded into time and was forgotten until after his death, when it was unearthed by the magazine Weird Tales and republished with the new title, Herbert West Re-Animator, 5 years after he passed. In modern times, historians do not favor this tale. L. Sprague de Camp says that, of all Lovecraft stories, those comprising Herbert West Re-Animator are perhaps the most forgettable. Bruce G. Hollenbeck says that, Herbert West Re-Animator is not one of Lovecraft's better tales. It's over-the-top, cliched, and blatantly racist. It has little of the cosmic horror for which the author would ultimately become famous. S. T. Joshi says that it is universally acknowledged as Lovecraft's poorest work. But as for me, I dig it. There are a lot of criticisms that you can level against the story, some of which I've already mentioned, and trust me, we're gonna get there with the others. But I think there are a lot of things that the story does particularly well, and it also does a few things that had never been done before. Its influence can be felt across media today, and like most things that Lovecraft worked on, it can kind of be seen as a trendsetter. Lovecraft writes this story as a somewhat parody of Frankenstein, and may have through that in turn inspired future adaptations of Mary Shelley's book, as the unnamed assistant who helps the Mad Dr. West also serves as the narrator of the story, and is one of the very first appearances of an Igor-like character in all of fiction. Victor Frankenstein carries out his deeds alone in her novel, but the character over time has more often than not been paired with an assistant underling to help him. The idea of this kind of character is commonplace now, and has been done in several different iconic ways in the past century. But in 1922, it was a pretty original idea, and it very well may have been the very first appearance of this type of assistant character to a mad scientist. A prototype of what would be popularized in 1931's Frankenstein. Herbert West Re-Animator is also probably the very first instance of a zombie devouring human flesh. After being reanimated and escaping West's laboratory, what once was Dr. Halsey creeps through the haunted streets of Arkham, Massachusetts and kills several people before he is captured. In the story, it states that it had not left behind all that it attacked, for sometimes it had been hungry. The number it had killed was 14. And these two sentences here are probably the very beginning of what would eventually grow into the concept of zombies as we know them today. And there is something about Lovecraft inventing the modern idea of the zombie that I feel is kind of ironic. Zombies at the time were a pretty different concept based on ideas that came out of Haitian folklore. People who were under the spell of a necromancer who were forced to do their bidding. And considering his typical racist proclivities, it is a little interesting that he didn't go down that stereotyped route in creating his take on the undead. It was not uncommon in his work for him to jump at the opportunity to force unneeded racism into his stories. With this tale, the creatures are the opposite of how zombies were conveyed at the time. Completely mindless and beyond control. Every time West brings someone back from the grave, they escape and cause some sort of mayhem. And in the end, they return to his doorstep and are his undoing. They are essentially what George Romero gets credited with 46 years before Night of the Living Dead even came out. This right here is essentially the midpoint of how we got from Frankenstein to The Walking Dead. Lovecraft is probably, over all other horror short fiction writers, able to disturb the reader. There is a feeling that I get when reading his work that I only get when reading his work. The mother, after being driven insane in The Color Out of Space, walking through the farmland on her hands and knees, is one of the most upsetting things I have ever read in a story. It is only mentioned in one sentence with no description whatsoever, and yet it is extremely unsettling. A lot of the horror of his work comes from the implications. He describes nothing. The sentence merely reads, "By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours." This is a criticism that a lot of people have against him. Many say that he is a writer who cops out at the end of his tales, as he refuses to give more than basic description of what the monsters look like, instead saying what the narrators witness is so beyond human comprehension that it is impossible to describe. But this was a very conscious style on his behalf, and is something that I love about his work. The horror lies in the unknowable for him, and he is best when manipulating our senses in this way with very little description. He forces us through lack of detail to imagine why these horrible things are happening and what they look like. He makes us ruminate on them long after we have put the book down. And I wish in the adaptation process that some of these elements were more considered or attempted. There's not a lot of subtlety in adapting any of his work, which is odd to me, because everything about his writing, while grandiose in style, is subtle. And I think that when this is done, such as in Annihilation, which is inspired by his body of work, it is the most upsetting and scariest. In the first chapter of the Re-Animator story, a freshly resurrected body tries to rebury itself into the earth. It is in pain and does not wish to be alive. It is one of my favorite details from the story, but has never appeared in any of the adaptations. And that kind of blows my mind because it is visceral and forces you to sit in the perspective of this thing and wonder if it is even human still. Re-Animator was also the first appearance of Miskatonic University, the college in the fabled town of Arkham, that is one of the most famous locations in the Cthulhu mythos, and would later go on to be mentioned or appear in stories such as The Dunwich Horror, The Shadow Out of Time, At the Mountains of Madness, Dreams in the Witch House, The Whisperer in Darkness, and The Color Out of Space. It is a special place within his world, and its library holds one of the few actual remaining copies of the Necronomicon. I also see Re-Animator as a make-it-or-break-it moment in Lovecraft's career. It wasn't the first time that his work had been published, but it was the first time he had been paid to write something, his earliest stories being published for exposure only. And if this opportunity had not come, then he very well may have given up on writing altogether, and wouldn't have gone on to produce the body of work that he did. He had a low opinion of himself. He was insecure and was very unsuccessful in what he tried to do during his lifetime, and he died early. We can tell these things from the sentiments that he expressed to his contemporaries in many letters that he left behind. And if a rare financial success like this had not happened for him, then we very well might not be talking about him or his work today. There are many elements in the story that are not present in any or most adaptations, which I think is a mistake. Even though every adaptation of Re-Animator has its own strengths and weaknesses, from a storytelling perspective, the original Lovecraft work, I believe, is the strongest. I love the scientific aspects of the story. The reagent that West uses to bring back the dead is far from perfect, and throughout the story he has more failures in bringing life into inanimate bodies than successes. And he oftentimes only has partial successes. A body that will open its eyes and look around before falling again listlessly back into death. And this is an aspect that isn't present in any of the adaptations, and I wish it would have been included, because West is a scientist who is trying to perfect his serum, and when everything he injects is coming back to life like in the adaptations, then there isn't a ton to perfect. West loses a lot of his logical motivation if his serum always works, like it does in the movies. The story takes place over the course of 10 years, so you get to see him improve as he starts on small animals and perfects his craft. In the film adaptations, the horror is more visceral, but the true horror of the Lovecraft tale is the psychological implications of what these two men are doing. The questions that the narrator constantly poses to himself, as to if he should quit or if he should continue down this trail deeper and deeper. The horror of the story is much more rooted in the mind. There also, in the adaptations of the story, is a lack of the manipulation of the assistant on West's part. In the story, the unnamed narrator is surprised to find a fresh body in their basement, and West tells him that the man was a traveler from out of town named Robert Levitt, who stopped by their home to ask for directions, who suddenly had a heart attack on their front steps. The narrator does not question this at all, but to me I think it is clear from this moment that West found out that this man was an out-of-towner who would not be missed, and killed him himself to experiment on his body. A few paragraphs later, as West is preparing to reanimate the man, the assistant says that he is worried that the experiment will not work because of the subject's poor heart. West does not pay attention to these concerns. It is later confirmed that West did indeed kill the man, but I imagine that if Lovecraft had complete control over this story, then he would have left this a little bit more ambiguous. And I really love this because it adds a further depth to West that isn't present in some later versions of the story. It makes you question any piece of information that he gives the narrator from that point on, and makes you retroactively look back on what he has said before in doubt. In all of the adaptations, the assistant sees straight through West, and works with him to accomplish their own goals, which I think makes both characters less interesting as a result. The narrator is almost definitely experiencing some form of Stockholm Syndrome as well. He has ample opportunity to leave, but never does. He does not wish to follow West as a medic into the war, but does so anyways. He seems as if everything he does is in trying to find the acceptance of West, saying at one point, "Of his methods in the intervening 5 years, I dare not speak. I was held to him by sheer force of fear, and witnessed sights that no human tongue could repeat." The narrator joins West's cause because he thinks that it is scientifically important, and he trusts West. But over the course of his career and the 10 years that the story spans, he grows less fearful of the idea of their experiments and more fearful of West himself. There is a definite character arc there, whereas in most adaptations the way that West acts would convince most people that he is crazy from the very moment that they meet him. And it is through their relationship in the story that we fully understand West as a character. We begin somewhat suspicious of him with the narrator, and learn how truly unhinged he really is, which is where some of the real horror of the tale comes from. And I think this paragraph in the last chapter of the story really tells more about West than any later adaptations do. The narrator perfectly sums him when he says, "Gradually I came to find Herbert West himself more horrible than anything he did. That was when it dawned on me that his once scientific zeal for prolonging life had subtly degenerated into a mere morbid and ghoulish curiosity and secret sense of charnel picturesqueness. His interest became a hellish and perverse addiction to the repellently and fiendishly abnormal. He gloated calmly over artificial monstrosities which would make most healthy men drop dead from fright and disgust. He became, behind his pallid intellectuality, a fastidious Baudelaire of physical experiment, a languid Elagabalus of the tombs. Dangers he met unflinchingly, crimes he committed unmoved." But there is a more evil side to Lovecraft's work that is particularly present in this story that must be talked about. As most of you know, Lovecraft was, in his personal life, well known to be vehemently racist, extremely misogynistic, and an overall piece of human garbage in most ways that a person can be. The following is an excerpt from the original story that demonstrates this, where West is called to the scene of an illegal boxing match and finds that a black boxer has been killed in the fight. The following language is shameful and unacceptable. It is a hard passage to read aloud, but I think it is important to include here to understand the full degree of the hatred that a great deal of his work includes. It reads as follows. "He was a loathsome gorilla-like thing, with abnormally long arms which I could not help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable Congo secrets and tom-tom poundings under an eerie moon. The body must have looked even worse in life, but the world holds many ugly things." And I think the argument of if Lovecraft should even be remembered for his achievements in horror and literature and discussed as an author is one that is valid and constantly needs to be addressed when talking about his work. It is a stain that always will and always should be against him. And I honestly don't know the answer to if he should be remembered in literary history for his creations or not. I don't think I'm even the person who should be able to say that. I'm sure there are a great deal of people who think that he should be buried in time, and I could see points both for and against that. I have had some people say that I am frequently too concerned with the politics or morals of a creator on this channel. But what I would ask to those is what genres are more political than horror and science fiction? Both are two sides of the same coin measuring the fears and hopes of the human race. And really condemning these things that he said and talking about how they relate to his work and legacy should not even be a political issue. It is just decency. Horror is about love. Horror is about empathy. And to those who say to separate art from the artist, it is kind of hard to justify that when his hate is so embedded in his work like this. In my personal opinion, the man was truly a monster. And if you dive into his nonfiction writing and poetry, you can see that even clearer. There is literally no question about it. And the fact is that I don't have an answer for this or really know how to approach it appropriately. But it is something that has to be mentioned. And the thing that most disappoints me in this as a franchise is that only once in all adaptations of the story is this ever addressed or touched upon. Most of them just gloss over it and pretend it's not there. You can find only one reference to it on a single page of the second Re-Animator crossover with the Evil Dead. And even then, it isn't done in a massive rebuke of Lovecraft, and it isn't done in any real meaningful way to critique or make modern commentary on him. And if there is one problem that I have with this franchise as a whole, It is the fact that none of these have in any meaningful way addressed and condemned that side of the original story in which they take their inspiration. And I think it is a theme that should run through all modern takes of his work, but it is seldom seen in his adaptations, and I wish it were in these more. While the 1985 adaptation is what rightly comes to mind when everyone thinks of Re-Animator, it actually wasn't the first work to adapt that story. Despite the fact that the tale had more or less disappeared for decades out of the public eye, there were several stories that loosely adapted the work in this time, or at least possibly drew inspiration from it. Weird Science Issue 1 features a story titled Experiment in Death, and while the characters' names are different and most of the events are toned down and changed, it can be looked at as the first full adaptation of the Re-Animator story. This features two doctors, Henry Fenton and Carlton Bradley, who are experimenting with their reagent on a dog that they have just killed. After leaving it for 15 minutes, the two reanimate it with success, but the dog becomes frightened and escapes before they can proceed with any further testing. One thing that I like about this take on the story is that Carlton, who is a stand-in character for Herbert West, actually has characteristics more in line with the existential questions that the narrator of Lovecraft's story has. As when they bring the dog back to life, he asks Henry, "What do you think he saw or felt in those 15 minutes? He then bends down and addresses the dog outright, saying, "Poor dog, if only you could tell us what it was like, what you saw." And I find this unique because it switches the roles of the characters and creates a new power dynamic than what was portrayed in the original story. The narrator Henry is the assistant to Carlton, but is invested in the project only on a scientific basis. He is only curious if the dead can be brought back, and is not interested in the philosophical ramifications of what that could mean. Whereas Carlton all along has harbored a secret interest in finding out what lies beyond the threshold of life, and uses his position of power to force Henry to kill him and then revive him after 15 minutes, so that he can experience and record the full death process. The twist of the story is fun and pulpy, as during the time that Carlton is recovering from being dead, Henry performs an autopsy on the dog from the previous day's experiment, because he learns its behavior has changed and become violent. A policeman informs him that the dog, who had escaped, bit 3 people and killed 4 other dogs, and had to be shot. And in the process of examining the body, he realizes that in the 15 minutes that the dog had been dead, his brain had deteriorated. And the story ends as Henry realizes in horror that the same is probably true for Carlton, who is in the process of coming back to life in the other room. I think an important distinction to make on if a story is inspired by Frankenstein or Re-Animator is the presence of an injection. At this point, the hypodermic needle is a symbol strongly associated with Lovecraft's story, and the franchise as a whole, and is, I think, what distances itself most from Mary Shelley's work. In Chapter 5 of her novel, Frankenstein mentions that he infuses a spark of being into the lifeless thing, an aspect that was inspired by the galvanization experiments of the late 1700s and early 1800s. And that line from then on was how we got to Frankenstein hoisting the creature up into the air to be blasted by lightning bolts. And so I think that the presence of an injection in the story could strongly indicate that it was partially inspired by Re-Animator, as there are some horror stories in this time that involve zombies being created via injections by doctors. Films like Sex Maniac, which was released in 1934 and is a very weird movie. While there are some Frankenstein-like aspects to it, the zombie is created by an injection from the mad scientist, which makes me feel like it is in some small part possibly inspired by Re-Animator, even though there are actually few plot similarities. In 1936, there was another film called The Walking Dead, in which a man named John Ellman is unfairly tried for murder and is executed by the state. But his body is stolen afterwards by Dr. Evan Beaumont, who was experimenting on bringing back the dead in order to do research on the existence of the human soul. And this does have deep ties to Frankenstein as a narrative. They even cast Boris Karloff in the role of John Ellman. But the fact that you have a doctor who is experimenting on bringing the dead back to life and perfecting that process over time may very well also be tied to Re-Animator. It is occasionally hard to tell exactly where these inspirations lie. The Atlas comic, Adventures into Weird Worlds number 24, also has a similar and very pulpy-like Re-Animator-like story that is fairly bizarre, titled The One Who Was Dead. In this, Dr. Carl Veblen creates what he calls a life generator, and in his own words he describes it as proof that I have found the secret to life, that I can bring a body back from the dead, no matter how badly decomposed. Even if reduced to dust, I can do it. And he demonstrates this by injecting the skeletal remains of a cat and showing it swell back into life. He gives the serum to his trusted friend Alec, who is a novelist, because he says that he has more to give to humanity, and that he is to die soon. And that when he passes, he wants Alec to inject him so that he can come back to continue with his research. But when the doctor does die, Alec is experiencing a bout of writer's block on his new historical novel, and instead takes the serum to Cairo and pays a man to steal the mummy of Cleopatra, so that he can bring her back and interview her for his new book. But he also, in this process, accidentally brings back the asp that she used to end her life with, and it tragically bites her and kills her again right as she's brought back to life, and then it kills him as well. This isn't a very good story by any means, but I think it is interesting to look at because the basics are all still there. You have two men with very different goals, the reagent, and the tragic end that comes as a result of trying to push past barriers that humans were not meant to. So I think this shows that even when told in a very different way, the basic DNA of the Lovecraft story still shows through even in works like this. I also think that Stephen King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary should at least be mentioned here. I don't think that this is an adaptation of Re-Animator, obviously, and I don't think that King ripped Lovecraft off either. But there are a ton of thematic similarities between the two works focused on the desire to hold on to things that have left us. King once said that, "I think it is beyond doubt that H.P. Lovecraft has yet to be surpassed as the 20th century's greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale." And on writing, he talks about reading his stories as a child, and some of his work, including most recently Revival, is obviously inspired by him. That book even begins with a quote from Lovecraft. But out of all his works, I think that Pet Sematary is among those that are most inspired by him. But King's take almost comes across as a rebuke of Herbert West. He doesn't care for how the reanimation process works. He isn't interested in the science or magic of it all, and is instead focused on the grief of a man who has lost his child, who will stop at nothing to bring him back, to mend his broken family. Pet Sematary is about the tragedy and grief of wanting a loved one to return to us. West is in it for the notoriety of being the man who stopped death, while Lewis is wanting something more intimate and personal. And I think that divide is interesting. I don't know if King was purposefully thinking of the Lovecraft tale when he was writing this novel, but it seems to me that it was at least influential on him on a subconscious level, and the pair make interesting reads when put together. And with that brings us to the most iconic work within the history of this story, with 1985's Re-Animator. And as everyone knows, while not very faithful, this is by far the best and most enjoyable adaptation of Lovecraft's story. The idea of producing a film based on the story came about from director Stuart Gordon having a conversation with his friends about how he felt that there were too many Dracula movies and not enough good Frankenstein ones. Which is honestly true. The sheer amount of Dracula movies out there is the only reason I've yet to do a History of Dracula video, even though it's a project I'm really wanting to do. It would just be a massive undertaking to do it the way that I envision. One of his friends then asked him if he had read the Lovecraft story, which he had not, and upon reading it decided to adapt it for modern audiences. He first was interested in making it into a stage play, which I find really intriguing. I love the idea of horror theater, and it has an interesting history behind it. I'm a little sad that it's a practice that isn't done fairly often anymore, and I wish he would have produced this first and then the movie later on. He would return to this idea later in life though in producing Re-Animator the musical in 2011. The play then turned into a 13-episode television series, but he was told that a horror show would never make it on the air, and that the only market for that kind of material was in print or film. And it was only then that he decided that it should be made into a movie. One thing that can certainly be said about this is that it is very much in every aspect a product of its time. I don't totally mean that in a bad way. As I said before, I really love this movie. But there are certainly things here, including the most famous scene, that definitely wouldn't fly today. And while that scene is very questionable and belongs in the past, there is no doubt that it became an iconic image of 80s horror. It's referenced in a ton of things, including a Best Picture winner.
Did you ever see that movie where the body is walking around carrying its own head, and then the head goes down on that babe.
And part of me likes this about Re-Animator, because its taboo subject matter connects to the idea of the film originally being a stage play. Splatter film was an exploitation genre that peaked in between the mid-60s and mid-80s, that portrayed outrageous amounts of violence, usually for comedic effect. There were, of course, films in that subgenre that have little humor to them, but the ones that are remembered most fondly today are the funniest ones. The ones that use the genre to be as outrageous as possible. It is, to me, one of the best cross-sections of comedy and horror. But when traced back to its very beginning, the genre has its roots buried in the horror theater. Specifically the French horror theater of the late 1800s and early 1900s, like the Grand Guignol, where extremely violent plays with realistic effects would be performed in front of live audiences. People would often pass out during these performances, and they were known for their over-the-top extreme subject matter presented in fun, energetic, and dramatic ways. One of the most common themes within these plays would be the first appearances of mad scientists and evil doctors within the genre. And to me, Re-Animator can kind of be seen as one of the last vestiges of true splatter films, and also pretty much one of the only ones to reach actual mainstream success. There are a lot of cult classics here, but pretty much Re-Animator and Evil Dead are the only two that the average person would be able to recognize just based on the title. It can kind of be looked at as one of the last links in this chain dating all the way back to early horror theater within popular entertainment. And you can see how a lot of the special effects, like Dr. Hill's head, were probably originally conceived for the theater. In fact, the idea is possibly more inspired by the 1928 play L'homme qui a tué la mort, which roughly translates to The Man Who Killed Death, rather than the original story itself. As in the story, Dr. Hill's head does speak, but only once, and plays a much less pivotal role. One of my biggest issues with this adaptation, as well as all adaptations of the Herbert West story, is the lack of any real, proper scientific processes. In the story, things are carefully planned. Bodies are weighed before injected, so that they receive a proper amount of reagent. Notes are taken, failures are made, and West slowly perfects his process. In the story, the narrator describes this as having bent every energy to the mixing of a new solution, the weighing and measuring supervised by West with an almost fanatical care. But here he's just injecting things all the time willy-nilly with random guesswork. It works here and adds to some of the chaotic humor that this adaptation is clearly going for, but I would love to see an adaptation that focused on the more grisly Frankenstein-like process of using the reagent like in the early sections of the story, because this film set the mold of how the reagent would work in all adaptations from here on out. The film, when it was originally a television show, was intended to have the visual aesthetic and setting more in line with Lovecraft's writing, which, if you haven't read him before, is very gothic in tone. Even though he wrote most of his body of work in the 1920s and 30s, they don't feel as if they are of that time. His writing was dated even when he was writing it, purposefully using antiquated spellings of words like jail, showed, connection, and demon, to add atmosphere to his work. The style of his writing would more line up with the visual look of authors of the mid-1800s, a nightmare vision of that era, and trying to adapt that look is one of the biggest hurdles that most Lovecraft adaptations falter with. I think that in a way his work is almost unadaptable. How do you translate a passage like this from the story to film that describes a zombie on the loose in the streets? The next night devils danced on the roofs of Arkham, an unnatural madness howled in the wind. Through the fevered town had crept a curse, which some said was greater than the plague, and which some whispered was the embodied demon soul of the plague itself. 8 houses were entered by a nameless thing, which strewed red death in its wake. In all, 17 maimed and shapeless remnants of bodies were left behind by the voiceless, sadistic monster that crept abroad. So much happens there in a short span with such an atmosphere of pure dread that I don't think that there is a way to accurately depict it on the screen with the same level of fear. Lovecraft's style is the embodiment of terror. There is a lack of detail done in a purposeful way so that you have to imagine what this looks like. And through that, the fear is heightened by each person imagining the worst image of this scenario for themselves. And the setting doesn't help very much either. as every time Lovecraft does give environmental details of his locations, they are always larger than life. Dark cities that hold dark secrets, constructions of non-Euclidean geometry. It is an incredibly difficult look to pull off even with a large budget. And because of this, Gordon decided to abandon the Lovecraft aesthetic altogether, making the film take place in a contemporary American hospital setting, which is one of my favorite aspects of the movie. They realized they couldn't do this story justice on a visual level, and just decided to do their own thing well instead of attempting the impossible badly. And that is kind of the brilliance of this movie. It is not really an adaptation of the story at all. The events are almost entirely different. They just take the basic idea of Herbert West and his reagents and the themes and characters of the story and recontextualize them for a 1980s audience. They even make the assistant here, named Dr. Kane, a more interesting character than West, and his goals and wants are what are most central to the plot. You really see what a strain having West in your life is like. The effects here are amazing, and some of the best to come out of this time. Dr. Hill's head easily being one of the coolest effects of all time. It's so simple, he is very obviously hiding his body under the table, but it just works in a great theatrical way. And even though it is almost entirely different from the original story, that is okay. Because they took something that they were inspired by, and in turn created a similarly great work that was aimed at the ideals of that current time period. The cast is all amazing. Bruce Abbott, David Gale, and Barbara Crampton are all great here. But Jeffrey Combs does stand out among them in his portrayal of Herbert West. He's just so fun to watch on screen. And the film would forever cement what Herbert West as a character would visually look like. As pretty much every single time he has appeared in media since this film, he has roughly looked the exact same. Overall, this film is an absolute classic that carries the themes forward from Lovecraft's original work, while also admittedly being a lot more fun to experience. It is a special memory from my childhood and will always be one of my favorite films. And this take on the character would be iconic for 80s cinema. It would be referenced in a ton of things, such as Demon Queen, Cellar Dweller, Remote Control, Brain Dead, Frankenhooker, Silent Night Deadly Night 5, Be Kind Rewind, and multiple episodes of The Simpsons. And it's ripped off in films like Re-Animator Academy, The Rejuvenator, Body Melt, Puppet Master 4, The Demolitionist, Corpses, and Serum. It had a huge impact and is more well known than its source material for a reason. Bride of Re-Animator would be released 5 years later without Stuart Gordon writing or directing, this time being replaced by Brian Yuzna. And while Bride isn't a bad movie, you really do feel the lack of Gordon in this film. Bride of Re-Animator is a little bit of a strange horror sequel, because it feels like a natural follow-up to the first film. Not that this story really needed another entry. It's perfect on its own. They had two other ideas during the pre-production of what this movie could have been that seemed more in line with how sequels were done at the time. One of which would have been a retelling of The Island of Dr. Moreau, with the character of West inserted, titled Island of Re-Animator, while the other was to be called House of Re-Animator, which would have seen Herbert West enthralled in a government conspiracy to reanimate the president after he suddenly passes. I'm actually really curious how both of these films would have ended up. Zombie president that you're trying to make look like a living person from a distance is a really fun concept. But from a storytelling perspective, what they went with made the most sense, because it's a natural follow-through on the themes of the original tale. Because a big part of the original story is that West may have at some point initially started out with noble ambitions. He may have actually at one point in his life desired to help humanity, but as time went on, his curiosities and ego began to take center place, and the narrator is horrified at some of the monstrosities that West creates. And this film expands on that idea that the original film didn't touch on all that much, as West here spends a great deal of the time seeing what would happen if he reanimated an arm and leg sewed together, or a dog with human limbs. It is a story about the corruptive nature of scientific curiosity, and taking ideas further than they should possibly go. The original Re-Animator film used a lot of the concepts from the Lovecraft tale. It didn't do them in the same way, but it still did use those concepts. And so for this film, they took what was left from the story and added in a Bride of Frankenstein-like aspect, with Dr. Kane trying to reanimate his dead girlfriend. Conceptually, this is fine, but the way that they do this makes little sense. because how this is represented in the story is by reconstructing a woman's body out of different parts, and putting Megan's heart in it to bring her back. I understand that they are trying to tell a story about love here in a much more Pet Sematary-like way, but from a scientific concept, the heart wouldn't be enough to bring a person back and make them who they once were. What makes me me isn't contained within my heart literally, but the story makes that so, and it's hard to take seriously as a result. The characters all feel a lot more cartoony this time around as well, which is very much a result of Brian Yuzna directing. His character work is his weakest skill as a director, but he easily makes up for it in the pure creative insanity that happens for most of the movie. All of his films could be described this way, and even if you don't like them at first, you eventually learn to love them. If you haven't seen Society that he made in 1989, you really need to. Despite not living up to the quality of the first film, there is a lot to love here. Bride of Re-Animator literally has my favorite opening shot in film history. Dr. Hill's head floating slowly towards us, telling us madly of his plans for revenge, is such an inspired and unsettling way to open up the story. And like most of his early work, it ends in a giant, bombastic, crazy situation that throws so many wild images at you it's hard to keep up with it all. And putting bat wings on Hill so that he can fly around menacingly is such a great decision. My only wish is for him to have bitten someone while flying. Ultimately, Bride of Re-Animator is a character study into the madness of where unbound curiosity can lead, and while it isn't as great as what came before, it is still definitely worth your time. And after this, the series sadly took a break for nearly 10 years, and in that time, I think some of its magic was lost. Beyond Re-Animator that came out in 2003 isn't a bad movie, but it isn't a particularly strong one either. The setup for this film is strange. We start with these two boys camping in the backyard when a zombie attacks their house, and they witness the police arrive at the scene where they kill the zombie and arrest Herbert West. There is no context for why this happens, or how West survived the end of the last film, but then we see that boy grow up to become a doctor, and is assigned to the prison in which West is being held at, and is convinced into joining him to restart his experiments. And it pretty much becomes a prison exploitation movie meets Re-Animator. This was made by the Fantastic Factory, a company created by Brian Yuzna located in Spain, that has since gone out of business, that focuses on creating genre movies. They have some really fun stuff in their line, but it's all fairly cheap and campy. Not that that's a bad thing. But as a result of this film being made through this company, everyone in it except for Jeffrey Combs and Jason Barry are native Spanish-speaking actors, which makes the acting styles in this film a little different than in previous films. But I think it mostly works. Everything is more exaggerated here, and it changes the tone. Everyone is doing a generic American accent, including Jason Barry, who is Irish, and it makes it all feel a little surreal, kind of like the English dubs of Italian horror movies. And this gets crazier earlier than usual for a Brian Yuzna film, about halfway through. But that is a good thing because the first half is pretty dull. But once the prison riot begins, the pace picks up significantly. One thing that I like here is what the film does with the character of Laura. As much as I love the first film and Barbara Crampton as an actress, in that movie her character doesn't play a huge role in the narrative. She is mostly there as an emotional attachment and motivation to Dr. King, rather than an entity unto herself. She gets assaulted viciously and has no means to defend herself. But here Laura is completely ruthless. She kills an entire group of men who attack her. It isn't amazing. You can still tell that this is very much from a man's perspective. But I feel like this type of portrayal is at least better than what was in the first film. Although there is still a pretty bad assault scene on one of the nurses, so it isn't all an improvement. This movie also does the thing where it has a tongue-in-cheek joke name for one of the main characters, with the assistant being named Dr. Howard Phillips, being the HP in the name H.P. Lovecraft. And this is something that I have always hated. Dr. Philip K. Decker in Nightbreed is too cool of a character to have a joke referential name like that. And pretty much the only time that I've enjoyed this was with Brigadier General Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove. I just wish people would stop doing this because it doesn't allow the audience to see the character as a real entity, as they instead are constantly reminded every time that their name is said that they are just a giant walking reference to something that is usually better. Overall, while not as good as the first two, the third one does have its moments, and every completionist who goes through them all won't be that disappointed with this one. There's just not a lot going on in it from a Re-Animator perspective. The first sequel added a lot of new ideas to the universe of those films, But this one just says, what if we do it again, but this time in a prison? It's the worst out of the trilogy, but there are still some gem moments in this. That same year also saw the release of the adult adaptation, Re-Animator, which finds Dr. Hubert Breast reanimating women for his scientific interests. In 2006, we almost got Re-Animator 4, and I actually really wish that this had happened. Stuart Gordon planned to return as writer and director, and wanted to revive the House of Re-Animator story concept from back when they made the second film, because he wanted to make a work that commented on the George W. Bush presidency. William H. Macy was at one point attached to star as the president as well, but it seems like the team had a difficult time securing funds, because nobody wanted to back a project that was going to show the current sitting president in that kind of light. And by the time the funds were secured, Obama had taken office and the project was abandoned. They even made some promotional material for the film to try and raise money, as seen here. And I'm sad that this never got around to being made, because I think it would have been really fun. The joy of these horror franchises is seeing them start off pretty seriously and slowly going wacky. And Re-Animator really never got the chance like this to do that, and I kinda wish that it had. Beginning in the 2000s, you start to see a lot of comic book interpretations of the character of Herbert West. And these are really compelling to me in the way that they are all really different from one another. He first appears as a cameo in Batman, The Doom That Came to Gotham. Here he is Mayor Harvey Dent's personal physician. He is a lot older, and I think that this is one of the most unusual aspects about this portrayal, because it doesn't give in to the usual style that the character is presented in to resemble the 1985 version of the character. He is overweight here and sports his blonde hair from the Lovecraft tale. This only deserves a quick mention in this video though, because it only barely is connected to the Herbert West story. But I will say that this is a pretty great alternative universe story that combines the Lovecraft mythos with the DC universe in some really cool ways. You've got Two-Face, whose deformed side begins to grow suction cups and tentacles, and eventually forms a portal, giant monstrosities discovered in the Arctic, dark architecture that looms overhead, a great redesign of Killer Croc with a weird mouth, cursed books, and Batman fighting Ra's al Ghul with a bow and arrow over a pit of writhing giant monster parts. It's an all-around good Lovecraftian time, but is only tangentially connected to the Herbert West story. He then appeared next in a 3-issue arc in the comic Hack Slash, a series about Cassie Hack, who hunts down monsters known as slashers. This is different from a lot of comic appearances of West, because it actually takes place in the same continuity as the trilogy of films, and can be seen as an extension of that part of the universe. And this isn't the first time that this happened with these movies. The first film received a 3-issue adaptation in 1991, in the lead up to Bride of Re-Animator, and the next year a 4-issue prequel about West developing his reagent came out titled Dawn of the Re-Animator. And this is really cool to me because it is officially the last time that we see Herbert West in this timeline after he escapes from prison. It is kind of an epilogue to that series. Here he is finally reaching the point where his reagent is actually fully able to bring back the personalities of the people that he injects it into. But like usual, his downfall comes from his other curious experiments. There is a really tragic moment here where Cassie, who has been searching for her family, has to watch as West destroys her mother, who ends up being one of his experiments. The story ends with West alone. His lab is destroyed and his friends have again abandoned him, until there's a knock at the door. 2 federal agents take him into their custody, because the president has suddenly passed away and they need his expertise, which is kind of the perfect way to tie that era of Re-Animator up. Primarily, most of these comics in this time were published through Dynamite Entertainment, beginning with Re-Animator 0, which is really cool, featuring some great art and a modified retelling of the original story, which also serves as a prelude to the 2006 comic, which found the Evil Dead's Ash Williams going toe-to-toe with Herbert West in the crossover Army of Darkness vs. Re-Animator. And I think that these are 2 franchises that make a great logical combination, as, after all, the basis of all of the evil in The Evil Dead comes from reading the cursed text of the Necronomicon, a book that originates in the writing of H.P. Lovecraft. But unfortunately, while this has a pretty decent start, it quickly falls apart, and ends up being not a great Re-Animator story or a great Evil Dead story, instead being a weird combination of ideas that, while fun, aren't blended very well. The story begins with Ash being blamed for a Deadite massacre at the S-Mart, which results with him being committed to Arkham Asylum under the care of Dr. Herbert West, which already shows a problem here of being really fast and loose with canon. Herbert West works at the Miskatonic University Hospital, not Arkham Asylum, which exists in the Batman universe. There is a location called the Arkham Sanitarium in Lovecraft's universe, but it is not found in this original story, and only appears in The Thing on the Doorstep. And that is the problem here, because this isn't really Herbert West as we know him. This story is connected to Lovecraft's version really only in name. Halsey, who originally became one of West's first zombies, is even still alive in this, pulling the strings. And what we have here is a take on Herbert West who, upon learning of the Necronomicon, attempts to raise the deity Yog-Sothoth from the dead with his professor. But this is actually more or less relegated to the background in this comic, as this is much more of an Evil Dead story than anything else. Herbert West is the final boss, and Ash is fighting through a hospital in Mirrorland full of deadites and reanimated corpses, trying to get him to stop his evil plan and save his girlfriend. West's abilities are stretched to the furthest here than they ever have been, and I think that mostly works in comic form. I feel like everything involving his character in this adaptation was inspired by the eye finger monster scene in Bride of Re-Animator. The monsters are all strange combinations of human and animal, weird amalgamations of flesh and bone, with my favorite being Herbert's eye that has vein legs that he can pull out and send throughout the hospital as a spy. This comic is very bizarre and makes a lot of decisions that I don't really understand creatively. With the biggest one being issue 3, where Ash gets pulled through the mirror by Evil Ash and enters the mirror dimension. This is a concept that has existed since Evil Dead 2 in 1987, but we had never really seen what this place looked like, and I don't think that anyone expected it to look like this or were very happy about it either, because the mirror dimension ends up being a twisted version of Wonderland. I understand how they arrived at that point. Going through the looking glass is a clear nod to Lewis Carroll's book, but taking that idea and going full Wonderland with it clashes so much with the Evil Dead and Re-Animator aesthetic that it kinda blows my mind that they decided to go this way with it. And in my opinion, kind of shows a bit of a lack of creativity. Evil Ash is revealed to be the Mad Hatter, Ash's girlfriend is Alice, and H.P. Lovecraft himself is the March Hare. I was digging the story for the first 2 issues, but starting here it really fell apart. Evil Dead and Re-Animator are 2 ideas that have strong visuals associated with them, and you can see this being understood and represented in the variant covers for the comic. But seeing the interior art more or less abandon both of those looks for most of the time, to throw in a third look that will clash with any aesthetic is just weird. Instead of trying to blend 2 iconic works well, they instead did 3 poorly. But despite not fitting very well in canon, it is actually pretty fun at times if you try and put logic out of your mind. I love how 2000s it is. You can just look at the art on these pages and tell that it is of its time in every conceivable way, which is best in the art but also shows the non-great parts of this era that have thankfully fallen mostly behind us, especially in its portrayal of women, like in this terrible panel in an action sequence that only exists for an upskirt shot. And another moment where Ash looks up her dress and comments on her rabbit hole, which goes well beyond the fun vulgarity that Ash would typically use in the films and TV show, to a point of being jarring and out of character. I get that Ash is supposed to have an abrasive personality and is a bit of a womanizer, but this line feels too much from him. While the dated feeling of the comic might not be for everyone, I think it is fun to see because when looking at all of these different takes on the Herbert West story, you can glean what was important for each decade to include. Every adaptation is the same basic story but told wildly differently. And I think that is kind of the enjoyable thing in examining these types of stories that have been told multiple times over a 100-year history. The second Evil Dead and Re-Animator crossover in 2013 is much closer to what I would imagine would result in the combination of these universes. But it also is not amazing for its own reasons. This finds Ash being teleported back in time to 1922, during the events of the Lovecraft short story where he inevitably gets involved. West gives him a new hand, and he becomes the new assistant to the Doctor's mad experiments, being held hostage by West stealing the Necronomicon from him and hiding it, which is his only way back to his original time. Here we get to see Ash and West actually bounce off each other in this crossover, which we didn't get to see in the first one. And it's fun to watch Ash's aggressive personality get under the skin of West while they work. And I love the ending, which mirrors the end of the original story, where West uses the Necronomicon to try and enhance his anti-death serum, only to release an army of Deadites that Ash has to deal with. And while this is fun, it is overall kind of a lackluster experience. The book is only one issue long and ends on a cliffhanger, and I just feel that with the unlimited potential that comics have in their storytelling style, and with these two franchises as strong as they are, at least one of these crossovers should have been amazing, but both are sadly just okay. 2016 saw the release of my personal least favorite take on the Herbert West story, with the comic also titled Re-Animator. Nick Barucci, the publisher at Dynamite Entertainment, said at the time that he hoped this comic would help the franchise to realize its untapped potential. And the confidence in saying that a 4-issue comic miniseries is going to improve on a cult classic horror film that is itself based on a story by H.P. Lovecraft should raise some major red flags. That is like me saying I'm gonna write an unauthorized sequel to The Shining and actually make it good this time. I'm not one to throw this word around a lot, but pretty much everything in this is cringy. It's a trash adaptation that understands nothing about the work that it is based on. The story finds West again experimenting with the Necronomicon, which blasts him through time and space, sending him from 1922 Arkham, Massachusetts to present-day New Orleans, where he begins his experiments again. And having the story take place in this city brings about a lot of problems that plague stories that choose to take place here. I don't understand the constant need to turn New Orleans into a cartoon, where everyone talks in an extremely exaggerated style. It is weirdly prevalent across all media, and this comic is super guilty of that, with characters yelling things like, "See, I've been dancing through this muck for lifetimes, pretty boy like you ain't made for the bayou," and "My voodoo girls, they comin' for you." It is just really strange to me, and it always feels a little racist. It's like if every single depiction of New York across all media was only allowed to use Ratso Rizzo for every single character. I don't know how this happened, but it's a pet peeve of mine that drives me crazy. And there really isn't an overt reason for this story to take place in New Orleans. Herbert West lives in Massachusetts. He has no real connection in lore to that place, other than New Orleans being the location of the Cthulhu cult in Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, a story that West is not connected to. The explanation the comic gives is pretty terrible, as at one point Susan, the narrator, says, "If an errant zombie finds its way back to civilization, well, these backwater folks are a superstitious lot. They'll chalk it up to voodoo." And if the story had actually tried to converse with the history of zombies in media, and actually made a commentary on the origins of them, that might have been a good reason to justify setting the story here, but this comic does nothing like that. This comic mirrors the original story by having West convince someone to be his assistant to aid him in his experiments, which I find interesting because it is a consistent aspect of the original story that almost all adaptations include. I feel like the original story included the assistant because Lovecraft almost always writes from the first-person vantage point, and it doesn't really make sense to tell this story from West's perspective. Thus, Lovecraft invented the assistant to give a more objective view of the events. He loved to have outsiders who aren't really connected to the story be the ones whose perspectives we see, because the madness of the central characters is much more upsetting to see when viewed through stable eyes. It's a technique that he uses a lot, such as in Pickman's Model, Shadow over Innsmouth, The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, as well as the original Re-Animator story. So I find it interesting that other adaptations like movies and comics feel the need to always include a section where West is looking for an assistant. Because comics and film by their very nature are not first person. We are already distanced from the subject and don't really require a further step. But it does give a straight man character to bounce off of West, so maybe this is why they always include it. Or maybe it could be in keeping with the parallels of Frankenstein by having an Igor-like character. The story in this comic starts off decent enough in the first issue, but really falls apart soon after, as West funds his scientific ventures through a new drug that he calls Unique, that is extracted out of the pineal glands of his victims that he sells on the street, that is described as the heightened energy of cocaine, the psychedelic effects of acid. It is essentially a dumb version of the mythical drug adrenochrome, and through this accidentally starts a war between a pair of rival gangs, called the Gree Boys and the Eldritch Crew, spelled Krewe, a drug cartel that worships Cthulhu. This culminates in a giant battle between the two gangs, with West finding himself stuck in the middle, as they fight for his supply of Unique. And in this, West is also depicted as the hero of the drug war, and that is certainly a take, This book actively goes against what we know of West, having him say at one point while he fights with an axe, "Throughout my life many have dismissed me as a mere academic, bookish, timid, a poor specimen. If only they knew how much graves I've dug up. It does wonders for upper body strength." I really hate this. West should never be the kind of guy to jump into battle with a syringe and melee weapon. He struggles with the assistance of another man to fight a house cat in the first movie. That is the kind of guy he is. His weapon is his mind, and even that fails him most of the time. Lovecraft had a poor view of himself that he often expressed. He was a timid man. He was terrified of women and people of color, and so he vilified them in his stories. He did not find himself attractive, but did think highly of his own intelligence. And even if he didn't necessarily mean to do so, he kind of wrote about himself through the character of Herbert West, and every adaptation should at least consider that to possibly be the case. Having Herbert West fight monsters is almost like H.P. Lovecraft himself picking up a weapon to do the same, which is something I could never see happening. Which is why the first movie is still the best that we have as far as depicting the character. West is much more likely to sneak up behind you with a shovel and hit you while you aren't looking. He's not one to confidently fight a giant axe-wielding man in the swamp and win. In the end, West kills the leader of the Eldritch crew in a really stupid way. The man worships Cthulhu, and West injects him with tainted Yog-Sothoth blood, and the two gods' jealousy tear his mind apart and drive him insane. The whole point of the idea of cosmic horror is that these beings are so beyond comprehension that the entirety of the human race pales in comparison to their greatness. And they are so colossal in size and might that they could not be bothered by the existence of human life. We are meaningless to them, just as bacteria are merely an abstract concept to us. Yog-Sothoth's body is made out of planets. He exists outside of the barriers of space and time as we know them. He can do anything, he knows everything. Learning of these creatures' existence drives most Lovecraftian narrators mad. The horror comes from the sheer fact that these creatures exist and you just have to deal with it. Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth would never wage battle over the servitude of a single man, let alone care that he even exists. Some might see this section as excessive, but my reason for spending so much time here is because I genuinely believe that one of the best ways to understand an original work is to dissect a bad adaptation of it. You can learn a lot more about why a great story works on a conceptual level by seeing a version of that same story that doesn't. You can arguably learn more about writing from reading bad books than reading good ones. But despite everything, there are a couple things that I really like here. West creates a giant bodyguard to protect him that he names the Velusian, a reference to the giant lizard people of Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. I just enjoy when Lovecraft adaptations make cross-references to other authors who got their start at weird tales. West at one point also defends himself and his actions by saying, "Do no harm. It took 10,000 years of humans under the knife to afford us the luxury of that tenet," which at least shows some thought of the internal struggle of being a doctor who is also experimenting on humans, and is one of the only lines of good characterization in the book. The art for the covers is also very well done, which is something I always appreciate to see in a series. 2 years later, Dynamite did another horror crossover with the miniseries Vampirella vs. Re-Animator. I love Vampirella, the superhero alien vampire from the planet Draculon, and this book does a great job of being both a good Re-Animator story as well as a good Vampirella story, which I imagine was kind of hard to do, as the two don't naturally mesh together as well as Re-Animator and Evil Dead should have. On paper, to me, this seems like a disaster waiting to happen, but it actually really works. Cullen Bunn wrote the script for this, and if you haven't read any of his work, you should really check it out. He is one of the most prolific horror comic writers today, and similarly to all his work, the writing here is really strong. I feel like this comic understands West as a character better than most other adaptations do. He says at one point, "Never let it be said that I have not suffered for science. I have been exiled by my peers. I have been reviled by society. One day, though, they will see the error of their ways, and they will rise monuments in my honor." This book understands that West is a weak man who sees himself as burdened by having to drag society into the future at any cost, justifying his actions by the good they will bring, shrouding his views of himself behind false altruism. Herbert West doesn't actually care about people in the way that one should. He only cares about what they think of him. He doesn't actually want to stop death, he only wants the recognition of being the one who did so. Herbert West is a raging narcissist. He makes a joke when he stops Megan from being raped in the first film. His actions are selfish and he justifies them to himself by saying that they are good for the future of mankind. And this comic is one of the few examples that actually shows this side of the character really well, not just in the dialogue but also in the way that he is drawn. He is constantly in weak positions, and his body language accentuates the theme of the character in a really great way. The art in this book is the strongest out of any of the comic appearances of Herbert West, using a realistic line style paired with a gray, yellow, and red color palette. I love the look of this book. It reminds me of Black Magic from Image Comics and Bernie Wrightson's work on Frankenstein, which are both great comics in their own right. The plot here involves Herbert West traveling to Mexico to resurrect a goddess of death from her tomb, after being killed thousands of years ago by Vampirella. The two become involved, and using her magic she reinforces West's reagent. The two create giant spiders, open a portal to a realm of death, and in realizing that she has become too powerful, West has to team with Vampirella to stop her madness. And all of these stories from Dynamite culminate in the insane book Prophecy, which finds Red Sonja, Vampirella, Herbert West, Ash Williams, and Dracula fighting Kulan Gath from Conan, who has summoned the Army of Darkness. Sherlock Holmes and Watson are also involved in this as well. 2018 also saw the creation of the Anacles and J. L. Giles comic adaptation, which is a really good start that I hope one day is finished. The line work, color, and texture is all great here, and it retells the first part of Lovecraft's story in the most faithful way that has ever been done. Pretty much the events here are the exact same as in the original story. And what I think is so interesting about this adaptation is that the creators directly consider the history of Re-Animator adaptations in working on this. In an interview with Dread Central, Giles had this to say on the adaptation process. I think that the Re-Animator tale has sometimes not been treated fairly. It has become a kind of cliche of the mad scientist, who laughs with a syringe in his hand. They have turned it into a comedy. That is fine, but I want to present a more human Herbert West. It is clear the man suffers from certain disorders, perhaps narcissistic. And I think that this approach is great, because it is really the only time that this story has had a pure one-to-one adaptation. Every other time they have played fast and loose with what they carry over from the original, and it is just nice to see at least one attempt to retell the original story without changing or adding too many things. I also really like the way that the character of West is visually depicted here, because it goes against the traditional stereotypes that have come to be associated with the character. Jeffrey Combs, who plays West in the 1985 film, has brownish-blackish hair, and so subsequently, every Herbert West since then has had the same. But here it is blonde like in the original story, and while not being a massive deal, it is a level of detail that originates in that story that you don't see in a lot of these adaptations, and I appreciate it here. One of the best aspects of this book is that it attempts to change your perception of the assistant character without actually going against the canon of the original story. Here he is an old man telling his history to a young medical student, and the narration that he gives is the narration of the original Lovecraft story. Giles said of this in that same interview that, "I want to allow a more direct connection between the readers and the characters. For example, as we all know, the narrator is Herbert West's assistant. But Lovecraft doesn't give him a name. He's a person who is there like a slave, a witness collaborator. He acts as an omniscient narrator, but story-wise he is totally dispensable, almost invisible. We have given Herbert's assistants more prominence and personality. We get to know him directly as an old man willing to tell us what happened. As the story progresses, his role becomes more important. He is no longer a mere observer." The first issue here depicts the events of the first of 6 chapters in the original Lovecraft story. And so while it isn't completely apparent where they are planning to go with this, you can tell already that they are planting the seeds to do something cool with his character in this retelling. I unfortunately cannot find much information about the status of this second issue, other than some tweets from Giles showing some work-in-progress art from it. He is also currently working on a second Lovecraft-themed project called The Deep Dark, that was crowdfunded last year and looks interesting, and I hope to see more from this take on West soon. And that brings us up to the most recent entry into the Re-Animator history, with the 2017 adaptation, Herbert West Re-Animator. And unfortunately, this is almost unwatchable. In this version, West has drastically different goals that are more in line with traits that are associated with the assistant character in the original story, as he is motivated to find the secrets to life and death after losing his daughter. And part of his main character arc is struggling with the horror that he can reanimate the dead but not bring the soul back with them. The movie is really hard to follow. Most of the time it is unclear what is happening at all, and there isn't much of a coherent narrative present. This abstract or surrealist type of storytelling can obviously be done well. It has been hundreds if not thousands of times. But it is a tricky style to pull off, and this doesn't really cut it for me. The film is plagued with cheap-looking visuals, underdressed sets, horrible uses of green screen, and strange ambient shots that feel really out of place. This movie pretty much misfires in just about every way it could, and is so incoherent that it is difficult for me to put in context historically, with the rest of the Re-Animator canon. 3 years ago, it was announced that another film adaptation was to be made by Sergei Levin, with the title Re-Animator Evolution, which was later changed to Herbert West Re-Animator. It was touted to be what seems the most direct film adaptation of the story that we have yet seen. At one point, Brad Dourif and Lin Shaye were attached to appear, but there's been little news of the project, and the only concrete evidence that it even exists is this teaser poster. Isle Empire Pictures is behind the project, and I hope to see more from this. At this point, it seems unlikely that it will actually come out. I can't find any recent facts related to the production, but I am curious to see where they go with this if it does come out, because in their initial announcement of it, they said that the film would be more strictly horror and that the universe of the story would be more firmly grounded in science. And with that, finally, we are at today, and there are even more versions of the story that we have not covered in this video, such as the stage musical based on the Gordon film, or the segment in Corpsorama in 2001, or an Imperfect Solution in 2003, Lovecraft's Re-Animator Tales in 2016, Dr. Hogback in One Piece, as well as this 2007 Swedish film where he is renamed to be Herbert West that I can't find English subtitles to. It is a story that stuck with me, but it obviously has stuck with others too for a reason. There wouldn't be this many versions of it from this many places around the world if that were not the case. It is a story about man not wanting to accept the inevitability of things, about how nature is supposed to act. And because of this, I think it is a really relatable concept. I think that if given a vial of Herbert West's reagent, we would all probably at least be tempted to use it at one point in our life. And that is what I like about this, because even though Herbert West's goals are not pure in any way, he also represents true human desires. This moment at the end of the first movie, when, even knowing the consequences of his actions, Dr. Kane takes the needle and pushes it into Megan's arm, in the futile hope of making her again, is tragic. But I think also relatable. This scene is the real, enduring emotional strength of the Re-Animator tale. It's a story about wanting to hold on to things that are leaving us, and is why it's been told over and over again for almost 100 years now. In a way, it's a story that people have been telling each other for thousands of years, just in different forms. Stories of humans conquering death, and it is for this reason, I think, that this is the most human work that H.P. Lovecraft ever wrote. The story that vibrates with universal desires that echo through time.